All right. Well, looks like we're just opening the doors here. We'll have some people joining, so we'll give people a couple minutes. But while you are kicking off here, love to hear where you're from. Maybe in the chat. I'm coming from Portland, Oregon today, and glad to be seeing everybody. Go ahead while we're gathering, if you would, and type into the chat where you're coming from, Pittsburgh, PA. I just got off a phone call with someone in Pittsburgh, so I might be talking faster than I normally do in my West Coast voice. Uh, hey, Ben in Wilmington. Scotland. Louise, that's awesome. Glad to see you. Madison and Naples, Charlotte, New York. Hey, Ryan and Austin. We're coming there soon for an ECLC conference, as you probably know. Hey, Hardeep in Allentown. Glad to see lots of familiar faces and some new folks. More Austin. All right. And Julie's still in my homeland of Northern Michigan. My parents were complaining that there was still snow up there, so glad to be in Portland right now. Good morning, Minneapolis. Hey, Tracy in Massachusetts. And good evening, Copenhagen. Thank you. One of my favorite cities. So how are we looking, Julie? Should we kick off?
Yeah, well, I think we're pretty much good to go. Go for
All
it.
right. Well, let's dive in then, folks. I am so delighted to see you today. I think probably for the most part, most of the people with us today have been on this journey the last couple webinars together, so I won't spend a lot of time in introduction, but there are some new folks. So I'm Aric Wood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Tigerhall. I also am the author of the Strategy Activation Playbook, which was built after about 20, 25 years of experience as a management consultant at Bain& Company building strategies as a leader in an organization trying to execute strategies at Intuit, and then ultimately as the CEO of Explain, where we worked with Fortune 500 company and global companies to stand up strategy and activate it inside their organizations. So a lot of what we're talking about today is really rooted in over the last 2 decades observations of what's worked, what's not worked, and how we can start to adjust our approaches to strategy and change activation for modern organizations. Today, we are at the halfway point in the webinar series. So for those of you that haven't been on before, we spent the first session talking about change activation generally. What is it? How do we do it? What's the theory and practice? The next four, we're actually breaking down the four phases of activation around envisioning the future, discovering the barriers to change in the organization. And then this week, we're now in the design phase. So how do we take all that learning we took from the organization and put it into a tailored, customized plan for the organization? Next week, we're then going to wrap up this part of the series about execution. How do we actually activate that plan and manage it with course corrections over time? And then the last two webinars that we'll be leading are both going to be around best practices. One around building a business case for change, and the other one around best practices for leading change from the C-suite. So definitely mark your calendars. I think those are going to be really rich conversations. For today, our goal is this. I'm going to start with just the contention that we're really great at marketing products to customers. Almost all the companies that you represent are very methodical about reaching target customers, understanding their wants and needs, and then targeting them to persuade them to make a different decision. Unfortunately, we don't apply some of those same techniques in-house. As we think about change, we oftentimes are still falling into the trap of creating one size fits none kind of marketing campaigns for our customers. So I want to reframe how we think about this. And I'd like us to think today of ourselves like marketers. So our objectives are to start shifting our thinking around change activation to think about like marketing a product. We want to talk about some of the various building blocks that can go into a change activation program to make it a more comprehensive campaign. And then we want to think about the design of a change activation campaign using that campaign language to ultimately develop a campaign blueprint for the plan we're going to execute in the execute phase. And as we have in the last couple sessions, we will share some of the tools and the exercises that we're working with so that you can start to apply them in your own work. So to kick us off, again, to set the table, I'd like to just do a poll to see where we're all coming from. And then we'll leverage that as we dive in. I'd like for your organization to understand who is responsible for planning and executing the change programs inside your organization. You're going to fall into one of these categories. Pick the one that most describes your organization and how things work at large, and then we'll dive in. I see Ryan's not seen the poll. Hopefully that's popped up for you now. I just saw it come up on my screen.
We'll give it another minute or so, but we have almost everybody answered.
I'm really curious how this is going to land.
All right, I'll show you guys the answers.
We got. Wow, this group has a significantly higher than statistically seen dedicated change and transformation group. So 42% of the folks on this call actually do have a dedicated change and transformation team in your organization. So by the numbers, that's probably a little less than double what we typically see across large organizations. So we're already talking to some folks that have seen the value of this. For 4%, we've got an HR team typically leading these programs. L&D is never usually in the driving seat for this, nor is the comms team. And then the remaining 50% is some combination of the above. So I think the key takeaway here that I want to highlight is that we typically don't have one seat where this happens. In about half of our organizations, or more than half of our organizations by statistics, it's actually parsed out across a number of different organizations. Oftentimes, those organizations are siloed. So the comms team has a part, the L&D team has a part, some transformation office or maybe a center of excellence or a product management team has a part. But collectively, that 54% describes kind of the way that most transformation gets stood up in organizations, which is that it's some combination of these above groups that are working together to make this happen. So the challenge with that, and we'll dive into this, is that we know that change is multidisciplinary, but often it happens in our companies without a lot of discipline. And what I mean by that is that because we have those siloed jobs, oftentimes the left hand isn't necessarily talking to or coordinating with the right hand. We might have the comms office putting communications out, and they might not be sequenced with when the learning and development is happening in the organization, nor sequenced with when we're actually rolling out a new brand, a merger, a new software implementation. So it becomes a disjointed customer experience, if you will, in that you're sort of seeing that episode of a show 3 or 4 versions behind the one that you should have seen first, and nothing makes any sense. So what we want to do is really think about as change leaders today, how can we start to shift this into something that looks more like a marketing campaign? And we have to start with the first idea, which is that it requires one coordinated campaign. So just like planning anything from a wedding to a military campaign, many people have a part to play, but they need to be coordinated so everything happens at the right time, at the right place, with the right activities. The second thing that we need to put in place is that we have to have a common governance model and measurements. So to stay aligned, all of those various players need to understand the goals and the milestones, the measurements of success, and who has the authority, importantly, to coordinate course corrections and realignment when those groups get out of alignment. So it's important to maintain the coherence of that campaign by having some commonly agreed governance model and measurements. And then lastly, and importantly, that campaign isn't just communications. It's not just learning and development, et cetera. It involves each of the 3 C's and even more than that. So we need to include the communications. We need to be thinking about the capability building. We need to be thinking about the culture shifts, as well as all of the other things that connect those dots, whether they be team meetings or workshops or walking the halls as leaders or two-way feedback loops. It's a coherent collection of touch points, interventions, and building blocks that are going to allow us to move people up the activation curve. So let's talk a little bit about the destination for today. Today's conversation is really about how we build that campaign map. Our goal is to build one, what I call run of show. So think of this as planning a wedding or planning a banquet or planning a campaign of any type. We need to coordinate multiple internal partners. We need one common plan. And that common plan is both the plan we're going to launch with, but it's also going to be our air traffic control system so that we can see as we're advancing what's working, what's not, and where we might need to make course corrections. Within that plan, we want to make sure that we have personalized stakeholder journeys. So rather than one plan that fits none, as we like to say, we need to have personalized journeys that is tailored to each different stakeholder group. And we know that if we tailor those to those stakeholders group and their different wants and needs, we're significantly more likely to be successful by ensuring the right messages are delivered in the right way to the right people at the right time. And then lastly, for each of those stakeholder journeys, we want to make sure that we have a different fuel mix for each. So some of them might be really learning and development heavy. This group is maybe on board with our change, but recognizes we're completely changing our ways of working and I need new skills and capabilities. Another group may not actually be involved in the doing of that new way of working, but they need to understand why we're doing this and why they should shift their behaviors in support of that new way of working. So those two groups need a different dose of communications and capabilities building, for example. We'll see that across all the stakeholder groups, and we want to make sure we get the fuel mix right for each one. So transitioning to a quick sort of point of view, and then we'll dive into the how. I know most of the folks on the call have actually been through most of the webinar series, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, maybe just 3 slides, just outlining kind of our point of view on change activation, and then we're just going to dive right into the work. If anyone is on the call that hasn't actually gone through the first couple, please just go back to webinar 1, and we unpack our sort of theory of change in pretty significant amounts. So you can go back and sort of dig into that and then come back and this will all make sense. But in review, change activation is the art and science of persuading people to align around, engage with, and adopt new ways of working in order to achieve a shared vision. So we're trying to shift the thinking around change to being a people-centered movement. How do we get people in the organization to be persuaded to join this movement to go to this new vision? It's very different than the way we used to work, where we sort of drove by and cascaded information, tried to drive change in the organization. This is not a tops-down approach. This is a from within to without kind of approach, where we're activating people to get on board with this movement and move forward towards a common goal. We know that the old way doesn't work, right? We've got plenty of data that says our old ways of change, for whatever reason, can continue to lead to 70 to 80% failure rates. So we want to be part of that 20 to 30% that are successful. And we believe that doing that is a function of centering on people. So in any transformation in any company, we have to go through roughly the same motions. We have to define our current state. We have to determine the future state we want to get to. And then we need to apply some level of pressure on that lever in terms of strategies and tactics to move the organization from point A to point B. The critical thing that we need to understand as change leaders is that the amount of pressure we need to put on that lever varies from transformation to transformation, from organization to organization, based on the unique circumstances of the people inside. So people are the fulcrum. People are what's going to impact how much we need to invest in that change and transformation. In an organization that's very resilient, very adaptive to change, that fulcrum moves over to the left. We don't have to put as much pressure down. We can run a much lighter activation campaign. In an organization that's much more entrenched or more resistant, we're going to have to think much more deeply around the changes that we need to make and invest more strategically and probably with more resources in our change program in order to activate it for potentially the same transformation that another company's doing. So it has to have a tailored approach is the major takeaway. The framework that we've introduced in the past and that we're going to leverage today is this idea of the activation curve. So the way that people learn, the way that people sort of become persuaded to join that movement and move together towards that vision looks like this, based on lots and lots of research around how people learn. They have to go through a hear it phase where they become aware of, they understand, and they get to a point of acceptance. Maybe they haven't bought in yet in the old language, but they're willing to learn and take the next steps. Then we can introduce a believe it phase where we're starting to introduce some learning and development, some new capabilities, some new ways of working, and people are acquiring the ways of working, they're applying them in their work, and they're internalizing the results. And then and only then can we start to entrench those behaviors in the organization. People start to integrate that this is a better way of working than the way it used to be, or I'm getting better results, or yes, we are coming together in a more coordinated fashion to hit our goals. We start to entrench that as our new business as usual. And we're, in fact, at this point, even starting to think about how to improve this and build upon it. So whether your organization uses ProSize ADKAR or Cotter steps or the McKinsey approach, all of those approaches, if you think about them, roughly map to this activation curve. So it's pretty agnostic to your change program at home, but it does give us a good framework for building a campaign of activation. So we're going to talk about how we do that. We're going to start to take that activation curve and we're going to start to take your particular vision and transformation, and we're going to put that into a campaign map in our coming steps. So let's transition to the how. This is the fun part for me because we've done a ton of work to understand and clarify the vision. We've done a bunch of work to understand what's happening inside the organization. Now we're going to go out and actually design the blueprint. We're going to design that blueprint for the house that we're going to take in the execution phase. We know from the last couple sessions that we never want to go right from plan to execute. That's where we fall into that activation abyss. So those organizations that do that have missed all the good work that we've done. And because we've done the work, we actually have a lot more information. So we did go back and understand what's the common story we're going to tell. How do we get our leaders aligned around a common vision so that we can help everyone understand the destination before we start talking about the plan? We've spent time in the discovery phase digging in and doing that research to understand who are the stakeholders, what are their wants and needs, what's unique about the organization and the environment that we should bring in as insights. And now we're bringing all of that into the design phase, where we're going to start to take those insights and turn them into action by assembling building blocks into an activation plan that we can then execute in a more thoughtful and targeted way. So in the phase one session, for those that haven't viewed it, go back and check out our Envision webinar, where we talk about the vision and the measurement, which are the key elements of this. How do we know where we're going and tell one common story about it? And what's the process by which we're going to measure our progress? In last week's webinar, we talked about the discovery phase, which is critical to tailoring a custom program because it gives us the insights about what's unique. Where do we put that fulcrum on the change lever? Where is the organization? Where are the people within the organization? What's happening outside of the organization? And what are the insights we generate from that we can take into account to really create a tailored plan? I do see there's a question for where we can access those past sessions and resources. So Julie will pop a link in for you to be able to access some of those past webinars, and we'll also send it out in an email. And now today we're at the third phase. We're in the design phase. And so here our goal is to chart the course ahead and prepare for those known and unknown needs. We know there's still stuff we haven't discovered, but the point of doing those first two phases is that we have uncovered all the known potential barriers to change. We've talked to the stakeholders to understand what are their unique wants and needs. And now we can build a plan that is hopefully at least 80% there, right? For those people that haven't done this work, what's going to happen as soon as they launch their plan is they're going to start hitting those obstacles and it's going to slow them down. And eventually they're never going to get off the ground. They're never going to create that movement. Our goal in the design phase is to take all of that learning that we had and put together a very clear campaign that anticipates those, allows us to move faster and more consistently. And then in the execute phase, our goal is then just to react to the course corrections that are necessary to keep it on track. So our goal in this phase is to create a campaign. We want to design that activation plan and detail the specific investments that we need to make to targeted stakeholders over time. We're going to use that activation framework. So the activation curve is kind of our starting point. And we do that again because that activation curve as a framework really accommodates in an agnostic way any of your change approaches. So we can think of this as sort of a common framework to launch any change activation plan. We're going to then break our activation plan down into three phases that map to that activation curve. So the first one, that hear it phase, we're going to think largely around communications. How do we explain the what and the why of our transformation? In the believe it phase, we're going to think largely about learning development and the support that people need to do the how. How do we support them to acquire and apply those new ways of working? And then in the live it phase, we're going to introduce some building blocks that are going to entrench culture change and those new ways of working into the organization for the long term. And then what that will lead us to is a totally customized and tailored plan. So it will lead us to something that really does speak to the unique wants and needs of each organization, sequenced into the time that it has to happen so that people are getting the information, getting the skills and capabilities, and getting the support they need at the right moment to enable them to continue to move forward faster together. So let's break this down just a little bit. This is obviously a simple one-page map, but conceptually, I think if you keep this in mind, you can apply this to the smallest transformation or an organization enterprise-wide transformation of tens of thousands of employees. The concepts will remain the same. So the first one is that we need to design a map that shows all three of these components. Becomes our coordinating campaign map for all the various players in the organization that are going to take part in it. Because it isn't going to be just one silo that delivers this. It's going to be a series of groups in the organization, a series of potentially partners outside of the organization, whether they be vendors, whether they be your ad agency, whether we outsource learning and development. We're going to have a cadre of different players that are all going to take part in the delivery of this campaign. For each of us, we need to understand who are the targeted stakeholders that we're working with. So the most important point here is that we don't need to design a plan for the entire organization. We don't need to get 100% of people up the activation curve. This is actually fairly clear in the research, but I think we don't yet kind of grok this in our heads that our goal to get ourselves into that 20% that is successful is not to bring 100% of the people along, but to bring all the advocates for change along and all the people that are sitting on the fence. We want them to get off the fence and start tilting towards our desired future. If we can get 30, 40, 50% of the people moving in that direction, the organization will go there. So to do that, we want to focus our campaign on our most strategic target customers. We want to be looking at who are the stakeholder groups that are most important to get up the activation curve first. If we can get those people up, eventually the other groups will likely follow. So we might overinvest in a couple key stakeholder groups in order to take those scarce resources we have and spread them about in a way that's going to give us the biggest impact. So think about those key 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stakeholder groups that we need to work on and make sure that we have a very clear lens on what those stakeholders need. The second thing we want to do to frame our plan is identify the key milestones on our journey. Perhaps we're marching towards a merger. Perhaps we're marching towards a brand relaunch. Perhaps we're marching towards a technology implementation. Whatever those key milestones are for your transformation, we want to actually mark those on this plan so that we can back plan our building blocks and interventions to prepare for them. So again, this is an effort in coordinating to make sure people are at the right place at the right time with what they need so they can do what's necessary to help us transform. We need to put those milestones in place so that no matter who's executing elements of this plan, we all know it needs to be done by this point, and we should plan against that. With those two things in mind, then, we have the X and Y axis of our stakeholder groups and our milestones. Then we're going to start focusing on the building blocks that go inside. So in this phase, what we're thinking about is what are the unique interventions that have to happen for these stakeholder groups? What are the common interventions that everyone's going to get? And how do we tailor those and sequence those according to the stakeholder groups and those milestones so they're coming out in a logical fashion that's going to build momentum in the organization? To do this, we're going to go back to last week's webinar where we've talked about discovery, right? We went through a lot of exercises to go get the information we needed to build this tailored plan. So if you go back to your insights report that you generated, which we can think of as sort of our requirements document for this transformation, we can go back and look at what were the stakeholder insights we got? What were the key stakeholder groups? What made them different? What were their unique wants and needs? Which group needed maybe more training and development? Which group needed heavier amount of communications? Which group needed more support? And then those insights need to come into this plan. We need to look at those organizational insights. How might this challenge the culture? What's going to change inside the organization if we implement this? What else is going to shift? What are the potential barriers to change? We want to take those into account and make sure we've got an answer for each of those. How do we mitigate the risks? How do we grab on to those things that could actually help accelerate us? How do we address all of those barriers to change? And then in the contextual insights, we also want to understand, okay, how do we understand what's happening outside the world, right? If our business is subject to tariffs, how are we going to prepare for that and respond to that in the plan so that we're not thrown off course if it happens? What are the other things in the context that might adjust or shift that could either work for or against us? And then finally, we'll take the summary of those things and we'll prioritize those things. And we'll say, okay, these are the most 10, 15, 20 things that we absolutely have to do right in this campaign that makes it completely unique and different. And if we can do that, then we will have a solid starting point. With that solid starting point of wants, needs, barriers to change, opportunities, we then can go and pick building blocks. And so this is kind of fun. This is the Lego part of the show. There's about 100 different building blocks up on the sheet. I recognize it's an eye chart, so we'll send this out to folks so that you can digest it. But over the course of the last 20 years of doing this work, we've identified at least 100 different ways that you can influence people to join this movement and support them on their journey. The phrase 10 times 10 ways comes to mind when I look at this chart because we know that sometimes to get things done, we need to say it 10 different times, 10 different ways. And the reason for that is that we have we have people that have different ways of learning, ways of taking information in, ways of digesting information. And so we need to not only share the messaging and share the capability building, but we need to do it in a number of different ways so that we actually reach each of the individuals in our organization because they're each unique. So what I'd like to do is break down the families of these building blocks just to be a thought starter for you to think about some of the new ways that we can work. Of those building blocks, I've broken them into sort of 12 families of things that you can think about as you craft your activation plan. The first one is sharing the story. This is fundamental and one we're usually pretty good at. What are the ways that we can share the story with people? But we want to make sure it's a mix of things, right? So it's not just the CEO at the town hall meeting. It might also be some short podcasts targeting to particular roles. It might be some leader-led discussions. It might be a brief white paper. We want to make sure that people can digest that story in lots of ways and possibly in parts. Maybe it's a short introduction that then allows them to go click on that deeper dive. We want to make sure that we accommodate people's different ways of working. So if we think about introverts and extroverts, for example, as an introvert, I may actually prefer to go quietly into my study and read the white paper or study that PowerPoint presentation before I start engaging with other folks. For those folks that are maybe more extroverted, they prefer to interact and explore with others as part of their learning mechanism. So what ways are we creating venues for that to happen? Are we creating open discussions? Are we creating maybe team meetings or workshops? Are we creating the kinds of places where people can take in information and then discuss and dialogue about it so that they can integrate it? We also want to make sure we create opportunities for co-creation and engagement. So not only broadcasting the information, but actually engaging and inviting people to start to shape the solution. So we want to think about some building blocks that create co-creation opportunities around shaping those solutions. Here's our plan to go forward. How will this impact your team? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? How can we make it better? Right? Those kinds of conversations that get people involved and engaged so it doesn't feel like it's just thrown over the wall at them. We want to create some ways for people to personalize the story. So there's that integration marker of where we're moving through the activation curve. We want people to start to integrate what it means for them. All right, well, maybe there's a guided discussion for you and your one-on-one with your manager to talk about what does this mean for your role and how might this need to shift your goals next year. Maybe there's a self-guided tour where you've got to digest the information and feed back, how your team might respond to this. What are the various things we can create to get people to really think about it and integrate what this means to me and how I'm going to behave differently next week? We want to introduce some tools for daily work. So, one example that comes to mind right away is doing a major process change with the US Marine Corps. And rather than just rolling out that process and doing trainings somewhere back in a room, what was actually most effective was a little waterproof flip book of the new process that had to happen that Marines could carry around in the pocket of their fatigues. What are the possibilities that we in our organization could create a physical, tangible tool or some sort of a supportive tool digitally that allows people to get the information they need in the moment of need? I'm opening up a new module on my new software implementation, and the training module pops up right next to it. Those kinds of things are going to be powerful. Seventh family, tracking progress. We want to think about building blocks that allow us not only to track our progression, but to be transparent about transmitting that. So measuring our progress is fundamental, but in fact, sharing that progress is also a powerful tool to build momentum and get people excited about it. If people see the needle moving, they're going to join and get on board. So we want to make sure that we're tracking progress and transmitting it in a transparent way. And then rounding out the last group, we want to also make sure that we keep people motivated, right? We have a tendency with these programs to launch it and leave it. And the reality is there's a lot of energy up at front, town hall meeting, one or two meetings after that, and then it kind of dies. These typically are 6, 12, 18-month journeys for major transformations. So we have to maintain that momentum, and we need to introduce ways to keep people motivated throughout the process. Regular check-ins, feedback loops, making sure that we're dropping communications and learning throughout the process, updates, best practices. What's going to keep moving people forward and recognizing that this is still important. The ninth family is one of my favorites, which is flipping learners to teachers. So again, we don't want this to be just a tops-down approach. We want people from within to be leading change. So how might we, for example, create a train the trainer program to stand up some change ambassadors with the tools to go out and lead some of this change from the front among their peer groups? How can we build capabilities internally to help equip managers or equip, respected peers with the messaging they need to echo and amplify what we're trying to get out in the organization so that people are learning from people in addition to any of the official channels? And then the 10th one, keeping top of mind, it's corollary, I think, to staying motivated. But as a marketing campaign, we need to think of this as a marketing campaign. So what are we doing to brand our program? Do we have a name for our program that's catchy and people can recite pretty quickly? Do we have posters in the break room? Do we have signposts in the organization that say this is important, this is something that we value? We want to make sure that we're branding our campaign and putting signals out to the organization that this transformation is important and ongoing. So look for all those sort of rituals, signposts, and flags that we can use in the organization to make sure that we're being present and being seen on a regular basis. And then the last two sort of speak to how we really embed and entrench in the organization. We want to have some interventions that are going to embed the change. So how do we actually take those best practices and transfer them to other folks in the organization? How do we build supporting systems, including things like new onboarding, new goal development, the performance management systems that are going to make sure that we're actually measuring and managing the new ways of working. So these are critical steps to embed it in the organization. And then lastly, we want to also build in some continuous improvement. So what are the kinds of activities that we could do that can learn from the things we've launched and even make them better? So can we do focus groups? Can we do workshops? Can we do after action reviews with teams that have already gotten up the activation curve to learn what went well, what didn't, and how we can make it better for other groups? Or how we can improve the thing we started because we're now learning the new ways of working and seeing possible improvements. So we want to build these in as well in our plan. So when we look at all those building blocks and we look at all those possibilities of things that we can build into those learning journeys, the last thing I want to impart with you on this is that the best plan here is to co-create the plan. And what I mean by that is this isn't about just you or me going into a room and saying, okay, I've got these 12 families of building blocks. I got my insights report. I'm now going to design this campaign. That's still better than the way most people do it. So if that's what you've got, go with it. But better yet is to try to engage others in the co-creation of this plan. Who are your other partners across the organization in L&D, in communications, maybe your outside agency that you could bring together to say, based on these insights, what's the right thing for the stakeholder group? You might get better ideas. Better yet, what if you can bring representatives of each of those stakeholder groups into that conversation? Hey, for the sales team, we think we're going to build X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Well, X and Y makes sense. Z is going to be fall on deaf ears. You should implement Q instead. So if you can bring more people into this conversation, again, you're more likely to result with a significantly better plan. And then lastly, we need to go through it one more time and design and refine. And so what I always encourage people to do is I have a refinement punch list that you see here on the right that asks a bunch of questions. I'll share this out with folks rather than reading through it. But the concept is very simple, which is we've now come down this journey, but we may have missed something. So let's go through a punch list of questions to understand, did I accommodate all the needs of this particular stakeholder that I found in the discovery phase? Did we accommodate these potential forces working for and against us that we discovered around the context? Have we addressed every barrier to change? Inevitably, as we go through this, we'll find maybe there's some building blocks that sounded cool to do, but aren't necessary. They're not really a solution to a problem. Or we missed a really critical thing that we need to make sure we have in this plan. And as a general framework, some of the things that you want to be thinking about as you're doing that refinement is this. We want to make sure that every building block on that plan, actually, we understand who it's targeted to. So is this a building block that's applicable to all stakeholders, in which case it's part of the launch for everyone? Or is this very specific to one targeted group? Let's make sure that we're clear about who it's for and who's going to get it and when. We also want to make sure we're thinking about the goal. So when we use this building block with a stakeholder group, which is our desired outcome, if we're trying to build buy-in, we shouldn't insert a building block that's around training and development, right? We want to make sure that the building block is fit for the purpose that we're trying to resolve. So that's a really important screen. The other two things I'd be thinking about are these criteria. So one is every building block on that page should answer a need that's identified in the discovery phase. If it doesn't answer a need, it's probably superfluous. So it might be something we can trim out of the plan, saving us resources. The other thing that we want to be thinking about is that the building blocks we choose should be authentic and appropriate to your organization. And so to just make that clear, one of the building blocks that I like is a hackathon. A hackathon is something that's well known in the software world where we bring a bunch of people together, we give them a problem, we say, okay, let's just all work on this thing to try to find a fast solution to this, and we rapidly iterate something that comes out. Great engagement tool, can be very successful in that context. However, if we go into, let's say, a banking environment or someplace that has a high degree of governance and compliance, people might be like, I'm not sure about a hackathon. That's maybe not the right way to work here because that doesn't really fit our culture. So you want to make sure that we're picking building blocks that are going to push people's comfort zones as much as possible, but not so far that they fall out of line of what's authentic in your organization. So a couple things to be thinking about there. So bringing this all together, we are now and only now ready for the execution phase, right? So a lot of our competitors have jumped right from their strategy into execution. They've skipped all the steps that we've taken, and they're very likely to have their plan hit a bunch of barriers to change right away, which will slow them down, and eventually they'll lose momentum. They'll be part of that 80% that fail. Because we've done these three things, we've gone in and really clarified the vision, the measurement system. We've done the discovery to understand what's unique about the organization, its people inside, and the external context. And we've now designed a tailored plan based on those insights. We can now take that tailored plan into the execute phase and have a much higher degree of success. Next week in Execute, we're also going to talk about how we keep that plan alive because, again, it's not a straight launch and learn. It's going to be an iterative process. So next week, we'll talk about some of the design principles that can come into the Execute phase to ensure that we're keeping that plan on track and keeping that momentum building. A couple of examples of what this looks like before we open up some questions for discussion. Um, we want to blend a plan with some analog and some digital ways of working. We might, in some groups, be really well off with a vision map printed out on the wall in a group meeting to talk through here's the vision of where we're going and why, and here's how we're going to get there. We might want to use a digital approach with some folks where we maybe create something that is a click and explore opportunity to say, all right, I don't need to know everything here, but let me click down on these three strategic priorities to understand what they mean to me and reveal more information. We might, over on the right-hand side there, want to create a meeting in a box. It could be a game that people play to rehearse new ways of working. It could be a structured workshop that leaders can take their teams through, but some way to engage people in group learning. Or over on the far left, it could be something that looks more like the way people learn today. When we're on our weekends trying to get current on things, I'm watching videos on YouTube or TikTok. I'm listening to podcasts. I'm maybe reading summarized briefs of things that are really tailored to my needs. Maybe I'm even using generative AI to create and take a report that really sums up the most important points for my role. We want to have a mix of all of those sorts of elements so that the people in our organizations can get the information they need in the way that they will best learn. If we do that, their retention rates and their comprehension are going to be significantly higher, and they're going to be more likely to join the movement sooner. So with that, I'm going to leave you with three key takeaways, and then we've got time for a couple questions. If folks have got questions, please pop them into the chat. I'll have Julie feed out the top two or three key themes, and we can chat about those. But before we do, key takeaways from this phase. In the design phase for your campaigns, the first thing that's most important is that you need to target your stakeholder groups. So we know that some groups are more critical than others for this transformation. Some need to get up that activation curve first, and all of them are going to have different needs. Second, we want to then make sure that for each of those stakeholder groups, we create personalized learning journeys. We want to select the right mix of building blocks in the right order to move your target up the activation curve. So how do we tailor those learning journeys for each of those key stakeholders? And then third, and importantly, we need to support a common coordinated campaign. So the reality is there's a lot of hands in leading change, and there's a lot of partners in leading change, and we need to keep them all coordinated and on one path. So if we have one plan and we have one clear governance model and measurement system, we can get in front of the problems that are going to come from discordant execution by making sure that we're all playing off of one playbook and that when the inevitable barriers pop up, we can actually address them quickly so they don't slow our momentum. So hopefully you take away today a couple of approaches that you can start to implement in your own ways of working. The templates that we've shared here as exercises, the frameworks, et cetera, we'll share out with folks in case you want to start using them. And then, of course, I'm always available as a resource to you if you have questions about how to execute this in your organization. With that, why don't we open the floor to some Q&A? Julie, do you have a couple themes we want to address?
Yes, so we have Deb who's wondering, there are ideal plans that can sometimes include a significant amount of individual activities for each change. When you multiply that tenfold or more in a major transformation, that happens. But oftentimes change orgs can be just a few people. How do you prioritize the activities in the plan that are more important than others?
It's a really good question. It's actually one of the biggest challenges we've had before is like, well, let me say this. Data and analytics have always been a problem for us as change leaders. Like it's hard to know how the program's going overall, let alone what is working best, right? So one of the things that I encourage people to look for is how can you implement your change plans in a way that is more trackable? Whether we're launching these through Microsoft Teams, whether we're launching these through Workday, whether we're launching these through other platforms, are there ways that we can actually look at each of these building blocks and measure which ones are resonating for folks, which ones are not resonating for folks, and then can we get in and understand why? And so what we need to do that is real-time data. I'm going to make a plug, a rare plug for Tigerhall here. This is the one of the things that we're really focused on doing is understanding how can we actually track real time what's working and what's not so we can make better course corrections. Because to your point, Deb, the reality is if we've got 10 things in the air, we might find that only two or three of them are really effective. And if we actually double down on those and maybe stop the ones that aren't working, we can save our resources and get better results and then use those resources and reallocate them somewhere else in the future. So look for the ways to track the data as much as you can. Even if you're using SharePoint, you can at least start tracking who's taken it up, who's actually consumed the content, and can I build a feedback loop to go out and learn from them what resonated and what didn't. You might have to do some of it manually, but the more feedback loops you can build, the more effective we're going to be as change leaders to keep the course corrections going in the right direction. Any other questions today? All right. So, Julie, do you want to make a quick plug for the conference that's coming up? And then I'll close by telling us where we're headed next.
Yeah, of course. So on May 8th, we're going to have a conference in Austin, Texas. It's going to be with a bunch of senior leaders in change. So if you are interested in these types of topics, how to lead better change, we're going to have a workshop led directly by Aric. We're also going to have a couple of different topics like how to lead change during disruptive times, how to build a business case for different resources that you might need. How do you lead an AI transformation? A lot of people are trying to figure out how to get that business value of AI transformations. So, yeah, if you are interested and are available, definitely sign up for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. So coming up, next week, we're going to talk about execution. So this will be the last of the four phases. So this will be another how-to session, but we really want to talk here about how, exactly to Deb's question, how do you keep these things on track? How do you make sure that once we've launched that plan, and we know no plan survives first contact, we will immediately learn some things are working, some things aren't. So how do we implement some design-based thinking into the execution phase to ensure that we're measuring and monitoring what's working and what's not and what's course correcting it? So I swear I didn't plant that question with Deb. Thank you for that question, but it's exactly what we're going to dive into next week. So join us for that in a little bit more depth. And then mark your calendars because I'm really excited about the last two in the series. We're going to be talking about best practices. So, two that have really bubbled up to me as key questions is how do I build a business case for change? How do I get those resources that I need to build the kind of campaign we need to be successful? So, we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to close the series with best practices for leading change from the C-suite. So, I hope you join me for those. Really excited to have you and have your insights for each of these. And as always, if you have any questions, any follow-up, want to dig deeper into any of these things, please reach out to me directly. You can catch me on LinkedIn. You can reach me at eric@tigerhall.com. Feel free to call me up. I'm here to be a service to each of you, and I'd love to collaborate around your change challenges. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you next week.